The war between humanity and the Zorathian Empire had raged for years. Planets had burned, countless lives had been lost, and the galaxy seemed to be spiraling into chaos. Captain Elias Hunter had seen it all, battlefields where the sky turned red, and the ground was soaked with the blood of both humans and aliens. But nothing could prepare him for the events that unfolded on the broken world of Seraphis 9. It was supposed to be a routine mission, a raid on a Zorathian outpost that had been gathering intelligence on human military strategies. The mission went wrong almost immediately. The outpost was a trap. The enemy forces had been waiting, ready to spring their ambush. The human soldiers found themselves surrounded with no way out. Elias's heart pounded in his chest as he barked orders, trying to organize his men in the chaos. Gunfire echoed in the distance, and explosions shook the earth beneath their boots. A wave of shock and confusion flooded the battlefield. The Zorathians had been ruthless, hitting their targets with precision. Elias's squad was down to just a handful of soldiers fighting desperately to hold their ground. But in the midst of the battle, something unexpected happened. Through the smoke and dust of the battlefield, Elias spotted a small figure stumbling through the wreckage. A child. It was impossible at first to understand what he was seeing. The child appeared barely old enough to walk, with large, wide eyes and delicate features that seemed almost too fragile for a war zone. They were unlike anything Elias had seen before, a Zorathian child, no older than 5 or 6, caught in the middle of the destruction. Bloodied but alive, the child cried out as explosions rattled the ground, unaware of the danger around them. Elias froze for a moment, the weight of the situation crashing over him. A child. A Zorathian child. The enemy's child. The rational part of his mind screamed at him to leave. His mission was clear: survive, fight back, protect his people. Yet another part of him, something deeply human, couldn't ignore the small, helpless form in the chaos. The child was lost. Alone. He didn't hesitate. Elias sprinted forward through the fire and smoke, pushing past his comrades who were too busy fighting to notice him. The child's cries echoed louder as he got closer. Elias's heart twisted in his chest. Without thinking, he reached out and scooped the child into his arms. The child flinched, their tiny hands gripping his uniform with fear. Elias held them close, shielding their small body with his own. A few more explosions rocked the ground, throwing both of them to the ground, but Elias kept them both covered. His body shielded the child from the flying debris, the sharp rocks that cut through, the air like knives. His mind raced. What was he doing? He had just saved the enemy's child. The same enemy that had been killing his people, tearing apart entire colonies. Was he a fool? Could he really protect this child in the middle of all this? But there was no time to think. The battle raged on around him, and Elias was running out of time. He quickly scanned the area, his military training kicking in. There was no safe place here. He couldn't escape, not with the Zorathians closing in from all sides. "Captain, we need to move!" A voice broke through his thoughts. It was one of his squadmates, Sergeant Thompson, urging him to retreat. Elias's eyes met the sergeant's, but there was no chance of retreat. Not with this child in his arms. "We can't leave them," Elias said, his voice firm. The sergeant hesitated, his expression torn. Elias wasn't sure if it was the child's presence or the desperation in Elias's eyes that made Thompson stay by his side, but the sergeant gave a quick nod. "Then we fight," he said, his voice steady. Elias turned his attention back to the battlefield. They couldn't outrun the Zorathians. There was no clear escape, and the human forces were too scattered to organize a defense. But Elias had one option left: fight. With the child clutched tightly to his chest, Elias drew his sidearm, the familiar weight of the gun grounding him. The child seemed to quiet in his arms. perhaps sensing the danger around them, perhaps because of the steady, strong rhythm of Elias's heartbeat. Through the haze of battle, Elias could see movement. Zorathian soldiers, their hulking forms moving with deadly intent. They were focused on the humans, their sharp eyes scanning the area for survivors, unaware that Elias had something they could never have predicted. A hostage. A hostage in the form of their own flesh and blood. Elias moved swiftly, darting between broken walls and destroyed machinery. He kept low, knowing the child's safety depended entirely on how well he could stay hidden from the enemy. The Zorathians were closing in. The child was a beacon, a living target that could destroy any hope of survival. But Elias had made a decision. He would not let the child fall into enemy hands. Not now, not ever. In that moment, the realization hit him like a jolt of electricity. He had protected the enemy's son with his own body, and the Zorathians would never forgive him for it. They would come for him. They would come for the child. And the consequences would be unimaginable. But Elias didn't care. There was something about the child, Kyle, he would later name them, that made him want to protect them at all costs. The soft, innocent look in their eyes told Elias that this child, though born of an enemy, was no more responsible for the war than any other innocent being in the galaxy. Elias made a vow right there as the fire and destruction raged around him. He would protect this child. He would stand against the Zorathians, against the forces of fate, and no matter what came next, he would not let Kyle suffer the same fate as so many others. The war had taken so much, but Elias would not let it take this child, not if he could help it. As the battle roared on, Elias made his way toward the one hope he had left, an abandoned outpost in the distance, a place where he might be able to find shelter and regroup. It was a long shot, but it was the only shot they had. With the child in his arms, Elias pushed forward into the unknown, knowing the fight for survival had only just begun. The winds of Seraphis 9 howled like a mourning cry, carrying the bitter scent of burning metal and smoke across the battlefield. Amidst the chaos of the war, one thing became clear to Queen Seraphina of the Zorathians. Her son was gone. The news hit her like a blow to the chest. Her blood ran cold, and her claws clenched with barely contained fury. Elias Hunter, a human soldier, had done the unthinkable. He had taken her child. Seraphina was not the type of ruler who wasted time on empty threats or empty promises. She had built her empire through sheer strength, not compassion. Emotions, especially weakness, had no place in her heart. But this act, this betrayal, shattered her carefully constructed control. Her child, Kyle, was the future of her people. He was meant to be raised in the palace, under her watchful eye, to become the next leader of the Zorathian Empire. The child was not just a symbol of her bloodline. Kale was the key to the entire empire's future. If Kale was harmed, or worse, lost forever, the entire empire could crumble. That was a threat Seraphina could not afford to ignore. "Bring me the human," Seraphina ordered coldly, her voice laced with a venomous calm. Her generals and lieutenants stood in silence before her, knowing the weight of her command. They had all heard the rumors, the whispers that Elias Hunter had protected Kale with his own body, risking his life for the child. This was not something a human would normally do, especially in a war that had killed so many of his kind. Seraphina paced in her command center, the grand hall filled with dark, swirling smoke from the nearby battle. The images of Kale, the soft, golden hair and innocent eyes filled her thoughts. The child had always been a reminder of what she fought for, but now Elias had crossed a line that could not be undone. He had taken something from her, something far more precious than any weapon or victory. "Find him! Find Elias Hunter and bring him to me." "Alive," she commanded, her tone unwavering. The Empire's elite soldiers, known for their ruthlessness, would now have their orders. They would track down the human soldier, and they would not stop until he was captured. In the vastness of space, Serafina's orders were sent out to every Zorathian fleet in the sector. Her eyes, glowing with a dangerous fire, never left the image of Elias on the display screen. She saw the moment he had taken Kyle in his arms, shielded him with his body as the battlefield exploded around them. A faint image, a captured moment, but it was enough. Enough to convince her that the human was not just a soldier following orders. He had made a choice, and that choice had sealed his fate. Back on the human side of the war, Elias had barely begun his journey to safety. The abandoned outpost was their only hope of shelter, and it seemed like a distant dream with every step he took. He was exhausted, his limbs heavy from both the weight of battle and the child in his arms. Kyle was quiet now, almost too still, but Elias could feel the child's small chest rise and fall with each breath. Despite the chaos, despite the war raging around them, Elias couldn't help but feel a sense of responsibility towards the child. Kyle was the one constant in this storm, a tiny life that had been thrown into the heart of a war he couldn't understand. Elias had seen enough of war to know how destructive it could be. He had witnessed the deaths of countless soldiers, the innocent lives that had been lost along the way. But Kale was different. As Elias walked, he kept his mind focused. His senses were sharp, trained to detect every sound, every movement. His soldiers had fought bravely, but they were outnumbered, and the Zorathians were not known for showing mercy. He needed to keep moving. He needed to find shelter. But his thoughts were interrupted by the sound of distant engines. His heart skipped a beat. He knew what it meant. The Zorathians were coming for them. His eyes darted to the horizon. Through the smoke and the debris, he could see the faint glow of their ships, large and intimidating, descending toward the planet's surface. They were relentless. He had to get Kyle out of there. He couldn't let them have him. Not after everything they had been through. Elias's grip tightened around the child, and he pushed forward, every muscle in his body straining against exhaustion. The path ahead was treacherous, filled with wreckage and broken machinery, but Elias's mind was laser-focused. He would not fail, not when the child's future depended on him. Meanwhile, in the darkened halls of her warship, Serafina sat in front of a massive display screen. A map of the galaxy glowed before her, pinpointing every location her scouts had reported. Elias's escape was not going unnoticed. The human was trying to outrun the inevitable, but Serafina would not allow him to slip through her fingers. She would find him, and when she did, there would be no mercy. The child would be returned, and Elias Hunter would answer for his actions. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of her communications officer. "Your Majesty, we've pinpointed the human's location. He is heading toward a remote outpost in the northeastern sector. Shall we proceed with the extraction?" Serafina's lips curled into a cold smile. "No. Prepare my fleet. We will make sure this is done properly. This will not be a simple capture." She turned her gaze to the view of space outside her command center's windows. The stars glittered like 1,000 possibilities. But one thing was certain. She would reclaim her son, no matter the cost. Back on the ground, Elias had reached the outpost. It was small, a simple abandoned facility, with little more than basic supplies and an old communications hub. It was hardly ideal, but it was the best they could do. Elias set Kyle down gently, his fingers trembling as he adjusted the child's position against a wall out of sight. He didn't have much time before the Zorathians would find them. He couldn't let them take Kyle. Not now. He activated the outpost's old communications system, hoping to send a distress signal. But the equipment was outdated, barely functional. He cursed under his breath. His options were dwindling. His thoughts raced. There had to be another way. Serafina's fleet was already on its way. The hunt was on, and Elias's time was running out. The stakes had never been higher, and the war's tides were about to shift forever. The walls of the outpost were cold, and the air inside was thin with the smell of dust and rust. Elias paced back and forth, his boots echoing in the emptiness. Outside, the sounds of distant explosions and gunfire still lingered, reminders of the battle that raged just beyond the shelter he had found. But inside, there was a strange quiet, broken only by the faint whimpering of Kale. Elias turned and knelt beside the child. Kyle's small form was curled into a ball against the wall, his golden hair tangled and matted with dirt. His eyes, wide and filled with an innocence that Elias could barely comprehend in the midst of war, met his gaze. For a moment, Elias simply stared back, feeling a deep, gnawing sense of responsibility for this alien child who had so unexpectedly become his charge. "Hey, Kale," Elias whispered gently. The child's eyes brightened as he lifted his head, the hint of a smile tugging at his lips. Elias reached out and softly stroked Kale's head, as if trying to comfort him through the touch. "I'm going to keep you safe. I promise." The words felt hollow in the quiet room, but they were all he had. What had he gotten himself into? How had a soldier, a warrior, become the protector of an enemy's son? It didn't make sense. But Elias couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper was at play. He had seen war, had fought in countless battles, and had watched as entire civilizations were reduced to ashes. But never before had he felt the weight of a responsibility like this one. Kale wasn't just another casualty of war. He was a child, a living being who deserved more than the violence of a galaxy at war. The child, despite his innocence, had been thrust into the center of this conflict, and Elias had made a choice to protect him. It wasn't the easy choice. It wasn't even the smart choice, but it felt right. There was no going back now. Elias didn't know how long they would have before the Zorathians found them. The comm system was barely working, and with each passing minute, the danger grew. The Zorathian fleet had to be close by. He could feel the pressure building in his chest. The air around him seemed to grow heavier, filled with the quiet weight of impending disaster. "Stay here," Elias said softly, glancing at Kale before rising to his feet. "I'll check the perimeter." He moved cautiously through the abandoned outpost, peering out the broken windows, trying to make sense of the world outside. His fingers drummed anxiously on the edges of his weapon as his eyes scanned the distant landscape. The planet was desolate, marked with the scars of past battles. Wreckage of fallen ships and broken machinery lay scattered across the surface. The outpost was tucked away on the fringes of the battlefield, but it wouldn't be long before the Zorathians noticed the humans' presence. They were skilled trackers, and they would stop at nothing to reclaim Kyle. Elias clenched his jaw, pushing the rising fear aside. His mind raced, searching for any possible escape, but he came up empty. There was no way out, not unless he faced them head-on. The thought was almost laughable. He was only one man, and he had no army to back him up. The distant sound of Zorathian ships grew louder, signaling that they were nearing the outpost. Elias turned back to the shelter where Kyle was hiding, his heart pounding. He had to make a decision, and fast. Inside, Kyle was still sitting in the same spot. He hadn't moved much, his small body shivering despite the warmth of the room. Elias approached him, trying his best to keep his tone calm. "We have to move, Kale," Elias said, kneeling beside the child once again. Kale looked up at him, his eyes wide with confusion and fear. He didn't fully understand what was happening, but Elias could see the question in his eyes. Why was the human so intent on protecting him? Elias felt a pang in his chest as he reached out and gently took Kale's hand. The child was so small, so fragile, and the thought of losing him, of failing him was unbearable. "Come on," Elias said softly. "I'm not going to let them take you." He stood and helped Kyle to his feet, his grip firm but gentle. The child clung to him, as though he instinctively understood the danger they were in. Kale's small hand tightened around Elias's fingers, seeking comfort in the soldier's presence. Elias didn't know if it was the child's trust in him or his own growing bond with the alien that gave him the strength to push forward. The Zorathians were coming. The thought pressed heavily on Elias's mind. He could hear the sound of engines getting closer, the vibrations in the ground becoming stronger. He didn't have much time. "We're going to have to make a run for it," Elias said, his voice low and steady. "Stay close to me and don't make a sound." He led Kyle through the dark halls of the outpost, keeping to the shadows as much as possible. The layout of the outpost was simple, and Elias knew that their best chance was to get to the back exit, a narrow tunnel that led to a cave system farther into the planet's surface. It was risky, but it was their only hope. As they moved through the outpost, Elias's mind kept racing. How had everything gotten so complicated? He had gone from being a soldier fighting for his people to a protector of the enemy's child. He wasn't sure how he felt about it. Anger, confusion, and doubt all mixed together in a whirlpool of emotions. He had always believed that the enemy was the enemy. That was the way of war. But now, as he looked down at Kale, he saw a child. No different from any human child. The only difference was the galaxy they were born into. Elias shook his head, trying to clear his thoughts. There was no time for doubts. The Zorathians were almost here. They reached the back exit of the outpost, and Elias pushed open the rusty door with a creak. The night air was cold, but the stars above seemed to offer a glimmer of hope. Elias turned to Kale, crouching down to the child's level. "We have to keep moving, Kyle. Stay with me." Kyle nodded, his eyes wide and trusting. Elias could see the fear in his gaze, but there was something else there too, something like hope. Hope that they could make it out of this alive. The Zorathian fleet was closing in, but Elias wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. He would fight for Kale, fight to protect him, even if it meant going against the whole universe. The cold wind whipped through the narrow cave entrance as Elias and Kyle moved deeper into the rocky tunnel. The sound of distant engines and the hum of Zorathian ships grew louder with every step. Elias's heart raced as he quickened his pace, pulling Kale along beside him. The child, still so small and fragile, followed obediently, his tiny hand clutching Elias's with a strength that surprised him. Despite his fear, Kale had a quiet determination in his eyes. Elias's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, none of them reassuring. He had no plan, no backup, and no clear way out. The only thing he knew for sure was that they couldn't stay in the outpost any longer. If they did, the Zorathians would find them. They were relentless hunters, skilled in tracking, and once they had locked onto a target, nothing would stop them. The cave walls around them echoed with each footstep. Elias's sharp eyes scanned the path ahead, trying to stay alert to every noise and every movement. The faint glimmer of starlight filtered through cracks in the tunnel above, casting an eerie glow over the jagged rocks. They were deep enough into the planet's surface now that it was nearly pitch black, save for the weak light from Elias's small flashlight. Kale's breath was shallow, but he moved without complaint, his small feet stumbling slightly over the uneven ground. Elias couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt every time the child faltered. He was so young. This war should never have touched him, but here they were, running for their lives, with an entire alien empire hot on their heels. Elias kept glancing over his shoulder, making sure the Zorathian pursuit hadn't caught up yet. The noise of their ships had died down. But that only made him more nervous. It was the calm before the storm. "We're almost there," Elias muttered, mostly to himself. The words didn't offer much comfort. The tunnel they were in would eventually open up to a narrow valley, and from there, Elias hoped to find a way to communicate with the human fleet. He didn't know if it would work, but it was their only chance. Cale was growing quiet, his small face pale under the dim light. Elias could feel the child's exhaustion weighing down on him. They had been running for hours, and the Zorathians were relentless. Even if they managed to outrun them for a while, it wouldn't be long before they tracked them down. There was no safe place here, not anymore. The sound of engines suddenly roared to life behind them. The Zorathians had found their trail. Elias's blood ran cold as he spun around to see the shadow of a massive ship hovering above the cave entrance. "No," he whispered under his breath. "Not now." The Zorathians had found them. Serafina stood on the bridge of her flagship, staring out at the desolate landscape below. Her eyes, cold and unblinking, scanned the terrain for any sign of the human and her son. She had commanded her fleet to comb every inch of this planet. And now, the human would pay the price for his actions. Elias Hunter had taken something from her, and now he would feel the weight of her fury. "Status report." Serafina's voice was calm, but there was a dangerous edge to it. "Your Majesty," a lieutenant responded, his voice shaking slightly. "The human and the child are heading toward the valley in the northern quadrant. We have them surrounded." "Good," Serafina said, a faint smile curling on her lips. "Prepare the extraction teams. I want him alive. But the child will be brought back to me at all costs." Her words were final, and the crew sprang into action, setting the course for the valley where Elias and Kyle were making their final stand. There would be no escape for the human now. Serafina would see to that. Elias didn't need to hear the Zorathian ships to know they were closing in. He could feel it, the weight of the inevitable. They were cornered now. There was no place left to run. His heart raced, but he didn't stop moving. Kyle was still beside him, his small face pressed against Elias's leg, trying to stay close. Elias knew that the moment they stopped running, the Zorathians would be on them. "Kyle," Elias said, his voice low but firm, "we need to keep going. Just a little longer. I'm not going to let them take you." Kyle looked up at him, his small hand still holding Elias's tightly. Despite the fear in his eyes, there was something else there too. A trust. The child trusted him, and that made Elias's chest tighten. He had to protect him. He had no choice. They reached the end of the tunnel and emerged into the valley, the vast expanse of rocky terrain stretching before them. The starlight was brighter here, and for a moment, Elias allowed himself a brief glance upward, as if hoping for some sign, some miracle that would save them. But there was nothing. The stars twinkled back at him, indifferent. As they moved forward, Elias spotted a small communication relay tower in the distance. It was old, barely functioning, but it might just be their ticket out of here. They could send a distress signal, perhaps get a message to the human fleet, and maybe, just maybe, help would arrive in time. But the Zorathians were fast, and Elias could hear their ships growing closer. They had no more time to waste. "Stay behind me," Elias told Cale, his voice steady, even as his hands shook with the weight of the situation. "Stay low, and don't make a sound." Kyle nodded, his small frame pressing close to Elias as they approached the tower. Elias moved quickly, but cautiously, his eyes darting around the valley for any sign of movement. Every shadow, every gust of wind made him jump. But then, as they reached the base of the tower, Elias heard something, a soft, whirring noise from behind. He spun around just in time to see the massive silhouette of a Zorathian dropship descending toward them. The ship's engines roared like thunder, and its weapons systems hummed to life, targeting them with deadly precision. Elias's heart leapt into his throat. He had no time to think, no time to plan. "Kyle, get down!" he shouted, pushing the child to the ground. The moment Elias moved to shield him, blinding light flooded the valley as the Zorathian ship unleashed a burst of energy. Seraphina's voice echoed through the bridge of her ship. Fire. The order was carried out without hesitation. The Zorathian fleet was closing in, and this time Elias and the child would not escape. The final chapter of this hunt was about to begin. In that moment, Elias knew they had no more time. The Zorathians were here, and the only thing standing between Kyle and them was his own will to fight. The sound of the Zorathian ship's engines roared louder as it descended, cutting through the night air like a predator closing in on its prey. Elias crouched low, shielding Kale as the bright beams of light swept over the valley. His heart pounded in his chest, the weight of their situation crashing down on him. There was no hiding, no more running. They had reached the end of the line. The blast from the Zorathian ship was imminent, and Elias felt the cold sting of fear clawing at his mind. But he couldn't let it consume him. Not now. Not when Kale depended on him. Elias quickly surveyed the area. The tower was their last chance. If he could get the signal out, if he could somehow reach the human fleet, then maybe, just maybe, there was hope. But the Zorathians were closing in, and the time they had left was shrinking by the second. Kyle, Elias whispered urgently, looking down at the child huddled behind him. Stay low and stay close to me. Don't make a sound. The child nodded, his wide eyes filled with fear, but Elias could see the trust in them. Kyle had come to rely on him, and Elias would not let him down. He had already made too many promises, and he intended to keep every one of them. The ship above them opened fire, and Elias barely had time to react. The ground shook as the blast hit the valley, sending debris flying in every direction. Elias threw himself over Kale, covering him with his body as the shockwave slammed into them. The heat from the explosion singed the air, and Elias could hear the distant thrum of the Zorathian ship's engines as it hovered, waiting for its next strike. But there was no time to rest. Elias knew that the longer they stayed in the open, the greater the chance they would be captured. His thoughts raced as he helped Kale to his feet, his own body aching from the impact of the blast. He had to keep moving. Come on, Kale, Elias said through gritted teeth. We have to move now. He took the child's hand and led him toward the communications tower. The structure was old, its metal frame rusted and weathered by time, but it stood tall against the valley's rocky backdrop. Elias's fingers tightened around Kale's small hand, his heart pounding as they reached the base of the tower. Every step felt like a victory, but the Zorathian ship above them made it clear that the fight was far from over. The tower's old communications array flickered to life as Elias quickly accessed its control panel. The screen was crackling with static, the ancient equipment barely functional, but Elias didn't care. This was their only chance. He had to get a message to the human fleet, even if it meant risking everything. Elias's fingers flew over the worn keys as he typed in the coordinates for the human fleet. Sweat trickled down his face as the seconds ticked by, feeling like hours. Kyle, still close by, watched him with wide, anxious eyes. Elias knew that the child was scared, but he couldn't afford to let fear stop him. The Zorathian ship's engines roared again, and Elias glanced up, his stomach twisting. It was getting closer. The beam of light from above flashed down once more, cutting through the valley and striking the ground near the base of the tower. Elias had no choice but to push. Kyle down, shielding him with his body once again. "Stay down!" Elias shouted as the ground trembled from the blast. His muscles screamed in protest, but he held his ground, keeping Kyle safe beneath him. The child whimpered but remained quiet, trusting Elias to protect him. The warmth of the explosions that rocked the ground was unbearable, but Elias stayed, firm, refusing to let anything harm Kale. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the screen on the communications panel flickered once more, and the words "sending," "message sent," appeared in bright blinking letters. Elias exhaled in relief, but it was short-lived. The Zorathian ship above them was preparing for another strike. They didn't have much time. "Kyle, we need to move!" Elias yelled, pushing himself to his feet. The child's small form wobbled as Elias helped him up. They had no plan, no escape route. But Elias knew they had to try. He could feel the weight of the Zorathian pursuit closing in, the inevitable confrontation hanging over them like a storm. As they moved away from the tower, Elias spotted something in the distance, a rocky outcrop that might provide cover. He wasn't sure if they could make it there before the Zorathians closed in, but it was their only hope. The child's safety depended on it. The Zorathian ship's beam of light swept over the ground once more, and Elias pushed Kale forward, urging him to run. The rocks were close now, just a few hundred feet away, but the Zorathians were coming closer with every passing second. Elias could hear their engines buzzing, a deep hum in the air that sent a chill down his spine. With a burst of energy, Elias sprinted toward the rocks, dragging Kale along with him. His legs felt like they were made of lead, but he didn't stop. They couldn't stop. Not when they were this close. The Zorathians were moments away from catching up, and Elias knew that if they didn't make it to cover, they would be trapped. Finally, they reached the outcrop, and Elias pushed Kale behind. A large boulder. He ducked down beside him, his breathing ragged as he tried to steady himself. His eyes were fixed on the sky, watching the Zorathian ship as it hovered above them, searching for any sign of their escape. The ship moved slowly, as if it were toying with them. Elias could feel his heart hammering in his chest, the anxiety rising in his throat. But then, just as the ship seemed to settle into position, the distant sound of another engine filled the air. It was faint at first, but it grew louder with every passing second. The human fleet. Elias's eyes widened in disbelief. It had worked. The message had gotten through. The Zorathian ship seemed to hesitate, its engines slowing as if it were considering its next move. Elias didn't wait. The human fleet was coming, and he had no intention of letting the Zorathians get another shot at him and Kyle. "We're almost there, Kale," Elias whispered, barely able to keep the relief from his voice. With the Zorathian ship distracted, they had a chance to make it. Elias held Kyle close, keeping low to the ground as the human ships grew closer. The battle for their survival wasn't over yet, but it had just shifted in their favor. The stars above twinkled faintly as Elias crouched behind the rocky outcrop, his body pressed tightly against the stone. The Zorathian ship hovered silently above the valley, its presence like a dark shadow that seemed to watch them with calculated patience. Elias's heart raced as he kept his eyes locked on the ship, waiting for the moment when they would be spotted. Kyle, still huddled next to him, looked up at the ship with wide, fearful eyes. The child was exhausted, his small body shaking with the strain of their escape. But he had not cried. He had been so brave. Elias's chest tightened as he glanced down at the child, wondering how a small, innocent life had become the center of this galaxy-spanning conflict. He had promised Kale that he would keep him safe, and he wasn't going to fail him now. Just as Elias was beginning to think they might make it, a loud, booming voice echoed across the valley. "Human!" The voice was unmistakable, cold, commanding, and filled with the power of an empire. Elias looked up, his eyes narrowing as he saw the figure of Queen Seraphina standing at the entrance of a nearby ridge, flanked by her elite soldiers. Her presence was terrifying. She was every bit the ruler her reputation suggested, powerful, regal, and unwavering. Her eyes locked onto Elias, her gaze piercing and filled with an emotion he couldn't read, but he didn't need to. He knew what she wanted. "Kyle, you have no place here, human," Seraphina's voice rang out, carrying effortlessly over the valley. "Release my son and surrender yourself. I promise you, I will spare your life. But if you resist, I will make you regret it." Elias's grip on Kale tightened as he instinctively pulled the child closer to him. He could feel the weight of the Zorathian queen's words, the cold threat in them. But there was no fear in him now, no hesitation. He wasn't going to back down, not when he had come so far. "Never," Elias said firmly, his voice steady despite the danger. "I promised him. I won't let you have him." Serafina's eyes flashed with fury, but her expression remained controlled. "You think you can protect him? From me? From the Zorathian Empire?" She took a step forward, her soldiers fanning out behind her. The ground beneath her feet seemed to tremble, as if the very earth was submitting to her power. Elias stood his ground, not moving an inch. "You don't understand," he said, his voice low but filled with conviction. "This child isn't just a weapon for your empire. He's a person, and I'll fight to the end to keep him safe." Serafina's gaze hardened, and she raised her hand. The Zorathian soldiers around her immediately moved into position, their weapons raised, their eyes trained on Elias. But Serafina held her hand up to stop them. "For now," she said, her voice cold as ice. "I'll let you have your moment, human. But know this, you will not win. The child belongs to me, and I will stop at nothing to reclaim him." Elias's heart pounded as he stood there, the weight of Serafina's words sinking in. There was no escaping her. Her forces were overwhelming, and her power was unmatched. He could feel the sharpness of the Zorathian soldier's gaze, the deadly calm that came with an enemy who knew no mercy. But just as Elias began to brace for the worst, a low, rumbling sound filled the air. The ground beneath him shook with the force of the approaching engines, and Elias looked up, hope flickering in his chest. The human fleet. At first it was a blur, shadows moving against the night sky. But as the ships grew closer, Elias saw the gleam of their hulls, the unmistakable shape of human warships cutting through the darkness. The roar of their engines grew louder, shaking the ground beneath him. For the first time since the battle began, Elias felt a spark of hope. Serafina's gaze flickered briefly toward the approaching fleet, her eyes narrowing in disbelief. She had not anticipated this, but before she could react, Elias's voice rang out, strong and clear. "Your fight is with me, Serafina," he shouted, taking a step forward, his arms still protectively around Kale. "Leave him alone, if you want. Me? Come and take me." Serafina's face twisted with rage, but there was also something else there, something deeper, more dangerous. She wasn't used to being defied. For a moment, there was a silent standoff, the Queen's fury meeting, Elias's unwavering determination. "I will not let you interfere," Serafina said, her voice almost a hiss. "The child is mine by right, and you will not take him from me." Elias didn't wait for her to make her move. He turned sharply to Kale, whispering urgently, "Run! Go toward the fleet. It's our only chance." Kale looked up at him with wide eyes, fear still evident, but something else too. Something that had been growing inside him since they had started running together. Trust. Kale nodded and turned to run, his small legs moving as fast as they could. Elias knew there was no way Kale would outrun Serafina's forces, but he had to try. He had to make sure the child got to safety. Just as Kale began to move, Elias turned back to face Serafina. She raised her hand again, and the Zorathian soldiers closed in, their weapons aimed at Elias, ready to strike. But before they could move, the human fleet reached the valley. A massive warship hovered above the ridge, its guns lighting up the sky with a sudden burst of fire. The Zorathian ship in the air above them was hit, its shields flickering as the powerful blast rattled the ship's frame. For a moment, Serafina was distracted, her gaze darting up toward the incoming fire. But that moment was all Elias needed. With One final look at Cale, who was now safely running toward the fleet, Elias turned and sprinted toward the battlefield. He could hear the Zorathian soldiers closing in, their heavy footsteps echoing in the valley. He wouldn't stop. Not until Cale was safe. The human fleet unleashed another wave of fire, forcing Seraphina's forces to retreat. But she did not give up. Her voice rang out, filled with the cold command of a queen who would never relinquish what she believed was hers. "This is not over," she shouted. "You have only delayed the inevitable. I will find you, human, and when I do, you will regret this." But Elias didn't listen. He was already running, his heart pounding as the human fleet fought back, the sound of their weapons filling the valley. Seraphina's forces retreated into the night, their dark ships fading into the horizon as the human fleet secured the area. The battle for Cale was far from over, but for the first time in a long while, Elias felt something like victory stirring in his chest. Cale was safe, for now. Elias looked up at the stars, his heart still racing, knowing that the war was far from over. But this was their moment, and for the first time, he allowed himself to believe that they had a chance.